Unmuting. And Insoo, you can go in 3, 2.
Hello and welcome to the Biotechnology and Society webinar series, co-sponsored by Harvard Medical School Center for Bioethics and the Center for Life Sciences here at the Museum of Science. I'm your host, Insoo Hyun. I'm the director of the Center for Life Sciences here at the Museum of Science. And if you've joined us before, you know the format for this webinar series. First, we'll have a conversation with a special guest on an emerging issue in biotechnology. And we'll have about 20 minutes at the end for a Q&A with you, the audience. If you have a question along the way, please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Type in your question, and my moderator, Lauren Walsh, will get through as many of these questions as possible for you. So this is a series that brings you, the public, together with leading researchers at the cutting edge of new biotechnologies. Today's topic is BCI technology, implantable brain-computer interface technologies that are now at a crucial turning point. Here to talk us through these exciting developments is an expert, Dr. Nick Ramsey. He is professor in the Department of Neurosurgery at the University Medical Center Utrecht in the Netherlands. Nick has been active in the field of implantable human BCI systems since 2005, and he runs the Utrecht Neuroprosthesis Project, where people with locked-in syndrome are provided with a brain implant to operate assistive technology software. Nick was instrumental in founding the International BCI Society in 2015, where he served as president until 2019. Nick, it is fantastic to have you. I know you're joining us from the Netherlands. Welcome to the program.
Well, thank you, Insoo, for inviting me. I'm happy to do this. It's a little dark here, but it's fine.
Well, this is truly an international webinar series. We're just so fortunate to have the opportunity to talk with experts like you from all around the world. For many people, BCI technology, brain-computer interface technology, may be kind of a new term for them. So maybe to ground a little bit of what's happening, why don't you explain what's similar and what's different to something that people may have already heard about, which is Elon Musk's Neuralink project. What is similar and different between what you do with this technology and what Neuralink is? Can you maybe walk us through that?
Yeah, sure. So we're basically in the same field, brain-computer interface technologies to restore lost function in people with neurological disorders. The similarity is that we record signals directly from the brain. So both, the whole field requires implants. There is a non-implantable field, but the signals are recorded from too far away from the brain to get detailed enough information for the goals that we have, which is to restore communication. So we build implants that have sensors that are in or on top of brain tissue. They record the electrical activity from neurons. And then we use machine learning algorithms to convert those signals into commands for a computer. And what we want to do is basically translate it to speech, computer-generated speech. So what we basically do is bypass the spinal cord and all the nerves that you need to be able to express yourself, convert those signals, translate them or transport them to a computer that translate them into what you want to say or want to do. So that's the general gist. The difference is more, Elon Musk is a business with a certain degree of secrecy that doesn't allow this very, very young technology to be scrutinized by others in the field, which it's, for better or for worse. The second is that I think Neuralink's goal is not necessarily to serve the people with neurological needs, but I think they're looking beyond to basically offer healthy people brain-computer interface implants to expand their their cognitive capabilities. And that's very ambitious, and we don't really know how that's going to pan out. So I kind of think that Neuralink hopes that they will learn on the way as they include more people for implantation. They learn how to use it and put it to good use for enhancement.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, thank you so much for that background. I'm going to ask you in just a moment to show us an image of what this looks like. But before we do that, let me just ask you, how far back does BCI technology go? You said it's a pretty new field. Where would you say was sort of like the beginnings of this? And what did it take to go from there to where we are now?
I think there's two beginnings. One is the beginning in non-invasive, where EEG research, electrocorticography with no electrodes that are stuck to your scalp, non-invasive. I think that started around early 1980s, where people showed that you can actually extract basic intentions from the brain. And the real breakthrough came in early 2000, 2004, 2005, where a person with severe paralysis was implanted with a Utah array, which is basically a small unit with 100 needles, 10 by 10 needles on a patch of 4 by 4 millimeters that you basically force into the brain, and with wires coming out to a connector on the head. And that was Brown University, and they showed that a paralyzed person could make a robot arm move or a cursor on a screen. And from there, I think the development of machine learning algorithms, computing power, plus the ability to miniaturize electronics to a significant degree, which everybody can appreciate if you look at your mobile phone, how powerful it is in just a few decades that it's been around. Those two gave a significant impulse in providing the platforms for hardware and for decoding software that brings us to where we are now. And it has not, progressed as much as we like, because building hardware for implantation requires a very significant degree of funding to prove that it's safe. There's very extensive protocols in place in the Western world. So that means that we expected, to make bigger breakthroughs about 10 years ago, but we're still on the cusp of having devices that will allow us to work with large numbers of end users and learn how to fine-tune the functionality of those for their daily living.
Yeah, so I'm sure the audience is wondering what this actually looks like when it's applied to a patient. Could you show us images?
Yeah, I'll show you a few slides to explain what basically the field is about. And let me see. This one. So basically, what we're really intending to help is people who are severely locked in syndrome. Those are people that basically lost all the control over the nerves that will cause contraction of muscles. And every communication that we can imagine requires muscle movement. When I speak, I have significant muscle movement. But if all my nerves are no longer functional, then I'm locked in. And my brain is perfectly capable of formulating wishes, emotions, and everything. Cognition is intact, but you cannot communicate it. Usually the cause is, bleeding at the core of the brainstem, or an accident, or what the larger numbers, motor neuron disease like Lou Gehrig's disease or ALS. Those people, by definition, end up locked in because they lose the ability to control the muscles of the hand and the face. So these people, there's an estimated 7 per million in the Western world who live mostly at home and taken care of by a team of caregivers and family. Their quality of life is, they rate it as almost the same as healthy people, which is kind of a paradox, because healthy people, if they imagine ending up in a locked-in state, 99% will say life is not worth living. But for people that actually grow into this state, like the motor neuron disease, it takes 6 to 12 months or maybe 2 years before you get completely paralyzed. they grow into it and their quality of life is still rated very high. The key factor for a high quality of life is communication and social interaction with their environment. That's the most important part. Most people with ALS will choose to die basically rather than have a artificial respiration system implanted, the tracheostomy, because they're afraid to get locked in and witness everything and not be able to communicate anything. So we started with an implant a couple of years ago for these people. We're talking about very small numbers of people that are, could be eligible for this kind of device. In total, we're talking about 70 per million that could be eligible. But once we've fine-tuned the technology, we're looking at much larger numbers of people that will benefit from the system, because once we have implants that perform better than the current limited assistive technologies, we can think about people who have had a stroke, who have problems talking, that might be restored, problems moving that might be restored. And those numbers are in the orders of, let's say 10 per 1,000 or so. And these numbers are going to take a flight. They're going to increase because of the aging of society, and most of the neurological disabilities occur in later time of life, increased risk of stroke, and trauma, and falling, and things like that. So in this project, we started in 2015, sorry. We implanted the first person with a device that will allow us to the user generate a click in software. So the purpose of the study was first to provide an autonomous system at home. So the philosophy was we need to develop the techniques to make devices work for people in need of them. So we wanted to offer them something from the beginning so they could use it at home and enrich their lives with it, and at the same time participate in research for the next generation of device. That worked very well in our first candidate, who was a woman with ALS. We implanted in 2015, and she could still use her eyes to control a computer that has a camera. It's eye tracker. But in the course of the first 2 years, she lost that ability, and we became to rely completely on this system. Just to show you the system, here's some rectangular strips. They're strips with electrodes that we place under the skull with surgery. And then there was electric leads that went down here, and then under the skin on the chest, there was a titanium box that contains electronics to amplify the signal, digitize it, and send it out to an external antenna that we connected to basically a tablet that would decode the signals and allow her to make mouse clicks, but not by hand or a mouse, but by imagining a movement which was picked up and translated into a click. We call those brain clicks. So the measure of our success was the amount of time that she would use it at home. There's about 60 people that have been implanted worldwide, but this is the first person that used it at home without any assistance from engineers and with a high degree of privacy. The computer would store the brain data that she generated during the day of use, but we didn't have access to that because it could allow us to recreate the conversations that she was having with the system. Now, she used it for a total of 7.5 years. We lost contact with her about 4 or 5 months ago, which means that the disease has progressed so far that we think there is, basically no intentional activity going on in the brain. It's severe, maybe compared to dementia. But we don't really know if this is the case because she got locked in and the system didn't get a usable signal anymore. So we cannot extract or conclude anything about what's going on in her head. So it's just our assumption that her cognition has declined. But she used it for over 2 years, for almost 24 hours a day, also at night, to be able to call the caregiver if there's any discomfort that she needed to be treated. Now, this is a very basic system, embarrassingly basic, just a click. The world is moving forward. There's a couple of groups that are focusing, including our group, on another part of the brain. This is the face area. In this part of the brain, you can see here, it houses all the neurons that cause contractions in the face. There's actually some topography. There's different patches that are associated with movement of the larynx or of the lips, the tongue, or the jaw. And that allows you to basically use the brain as a display. It has different patterns of activity, different patches that light up at any given moment, and you relate those patterns to specific movements of the mouth, and using that knowledge, you can translate it into computer-generated speech. Now, two groups, both in California, with very different electrodes. I won't go into that, it's too detailed. They both got very same results with fundamentally different devices, but they both record from the same region that I just showed you. And they were capable of allowing the users to generate words. Those words were decoded from the brain patterns and have them spoken by a computer up to about 60, 70 words per minute, which for us was a huge breakthrough. Now, nevertheless, this is seriously in the lab. These systems don't work at home because the brain has kind of a habit to change its patterns based on environment and everything. It's an additional degree of complexity of the signal that we haven't mastered yet. And that's the point of where we're at. And I just want to show this as the last slide, the development of the field. The first level we've seen where the goal is to find target brain regions, the tools to record and how to decode, all neuroscience, engineering, and mathematics. And all the publications were about how well you could decode in terms of performance, like you can accurately decode 50% of the words that a person tries to speak. And the second level is where industry starts to come in, where they start to provide safe implants, and you start to get standardized BCI performance, so more like how many words can you generate. And the cost, the risk of failure at this level is pretty high. The cost is very high. Things may fail, may turn out to be unsafe, so we're facing that reality in the field. And the optimization and the performance, those, what does it take to make it work at home with these additional disruptive factors in the environment of the user. And the third level that we're also starting to face is what can we actually offer an end user? Is an implant beneficial to a user? That will take the next 5 or 10 years because you need a certain number of users to be able to say that yes or no, you can or cannot offer them something that's beneficial to their daily lives. And then the fourth stage, we're still quite away from that, is what characteristics of people predict whether the system is going to work or not. Mm-hmm. And we need to figure out what it takes to learn to use the implant. So I'll leave it at this. It's kind of a very fast, short trip through the field, but I imagine we will discuss things more in depth. Thanks.
So when this technology was first developed, was it always for this type of medical application for locked-in syndrome? Was that always the goal, to help those people communicate?
It's a good question. I think in the beginning it was more of, part of neuroscience where you actually show that, you found some regularity in how the brain works that you can use to control things in the outside world. It's more of a scientific interest, and it's only in around 2005 that people started to say, well, this could actually use people in need of help for neurological deficits. Mm-hmm. And since then, you see the whole field move towards that purpose. Mm-hmm. And one way you see that is that a lot of the groups that were working with implants in patients for research were trying to have them move robot arms. But nobody needs to move a robot arm because you can control things by speech nowadays. And more of those groups are switching to decoding speech to focus on communication. And communicate, the only purpose to develop things for communication is to help people out that have a problem with the communication, because healthy people have excellent ways of communicating in fast and multi-dimensional ways.
So I want to remind the audience that if you have any questions for Dr. Ramsey, please type it into the Q&A box at the bottom, and we'll get to as many of those as we can. I'm wondering, for successful use of this tool, it would have to be a combination of just how robust the tool is itself and also how well the user can use it. Is there kind of a steep learning curve for the patient who first received this? Does it take a while for them to learn how to use it? And what does that training sort of look like?
Yeah, it did. In the earlier days, the first people implanted with the devices in 2000 up to 2010, you would control a robot arm, but you would have to imagine movements that were not necessarily related to that arm. Like, try to move your shoulder, would bend the elbow of the robot arm, things like that. Since then, with the increase of the number of electrodes that you could implant, people started to look at replicating the intended movement in the brain. So that got a little bit better, and then once we switched to the face area to decode speech, the whole goal is to not have people learn it, but just try to speak in your head. To basically try to speak, nothing comes out because nothing moves, and that will generate the patterns that we're aiming to decode. So right now, and I think in the near future, we hope we don't need a steep learning curve for people, but we just don't know if this works for everyone. And one of the things is, if someone has not spoken for 5 years, how much of that function of that part of the cortex is still intact? Do they need to relearn to speak? Those are things that we really don't know. But the aim of the research is to extract natural intended movements.
So I'm going to have a few more questions kind of around the research side of this, and then I want to zoom out to kind of the broader social implications. But let me ask a few more about the research itself. So do most of the people who receive these implants, are they ALS patients that are heading toward lockdown, or they're in lockdown? Are they typically people in the ALS community, or are there many outside that community?
I think there's a lot of people with some kind of trauma, car accident, maybe something related to weapons. The people with ALS, they are in there. I wouldn't be able to say, but I would say less than half, maybe a third, maybe a quarter of the total of roughly 60 that I talked about. They're not necessarily the best candidate because they, that within a few years they will no longer be able to generate activity in their brain simply because of the disease. So there's a couple of them, but they typically keep the system in for research for somewhere between 1 and 4 years, depending on how far they go. All the other people have no progressive disease, and they will be able to use the system. The problem with that group, though, is that they don't necessarily have a purpose for it in daily life, because people with brainstem stroke or trauma, whatever they lost in function, they'll recoup a little bit of it because there's some recovery in brain tissue, and that will always be better than what we can perform right now. So even if you can use a single muscle in your hand reliably, we're not going to be able to compete with that yet. Now, these people have assistive technologies that are very affordable, like chin switches and things like that. This is not yet affordable, so we're not at a competitive level. While for ALS, this will provide something that there is no other alternative, because that their function, their capabilities will basically decline to zero, at which point any assistive technology will fail except for these. But that we're not there yet, that researchers really focus on people with ALS for that particular purpose. Not enough yet. We're trying it, but the numbers are very small. We need multiple labs to do the same thing.
So do all the people who qualify for the implant for research, do they all have to be actually in a locked-in state?
No. I kind of separate between the US, where most of the activities are taking place, and most of them with the needles, the Utah arrays. The only requirement is that they have a certain level of paralysis, but they typically, the researchers are not interested in people with locked-in state because it's very difficult to get feedback from them.
Right.
And their care regimen is so severe that that makes research, complicated to navigate in between that. And there are people that really need something, and I'm not necessarily convinced that all the researchers working with BCI think that they can actually offer that, which would be a home use of a system.
Yeah, that would seem to make sense to me from a research and technology development standpoint, that there could be some communication and kind of user experience feedback. What's the situation in Utrecht? Do they have to be locked in there? Because you mentioned the U.S. They do. And what's the reason for that?
But that's kind of what we chose in 2008 when we started with the concept of BCI implants. We had a lengthy discussions internally about what we would like to achieve, and we ended up saying, we're not going to get fancy or sophisticated decoding of robot arms or decoding words. We're going to make a click that is, you put all the degrees of freedom of those brain signals in one single event because you want it to be 95% accurate. Having done that, the second thing was that we wanted to show that we can offer something to people that they cannot get in any other way. And so the whole goal was to work with people with locked-in state and see if we can offer them something and basically benefit from the fact that we didn't have to compete with more sophisticated assistive technologies because these patients could no longer use them. And that's what we're still doing. I actually just came out of surgery where we put a much more sophisticated system than the one I just showed in a person who is locked in, and she can only move her eyes to indicate yes and no. And I think this is the population that will really show the benefit of BCI developments and BCI technology. So it's our hallmark to work with BCI, but most groups don't like it.
Yeah.
But there's a certain risk of failure because they're so severely paralyzed.
So you've said that BCI technology is at a turning point. What do you mean by that?
It's a technology. It's the two things. The hardware, I see now that there is an increasing number of companies that are moving in the field, a lot of them, most of them startups, building the hardware that we need, which is, very sophisticated, but it's becoming more suitable for human implants. It's safe. There's large investments behind there because you want to prove safety of an implant in the brain or on the brain. You're talking about a cost picture of maybe like $30 million or so before you can start implanting in the first patient. And the second is machine learning advances. ChatGPT is a reflection of the rapid capabilities that we equally use in this context. It's not that we use ChatGPT, but all the algorithms are becoming available that we can make use of to get a significant step up in performance. And I'm talking about decoding these 60 words per minute. And ideally, we would like someone to be able to communicate through a computer in real time so they can actually participate in social conversation, which is impossible if you have to wait for 10 seconds until your sentence is decoded. You're always too late, right? Especially if it's nice and dynamic conversation. The topic is already one or two topics past, and then your sentence comes, and you feel kind of out of sync. So that would be an amazing
Yeah.
achievement.
Well, it would be hard to tell jokes like that. So what kind of commercial uses do you think are possible with this technology? Where might this go?
Yeah, I think it's a really big issue for investors. The first market would be those 7 in a million that I talked about, people with locked-in state that want to actually stay alive to see their children or grandchildren grow up. That's not a viable market because these devices, they're probably going to be somewhere around 50,000 per device. So you need a lot of to sell a lot of them to be able to get back in the black after your pre-investment. But if we can get, speech decoding, then we'll move into the much larger arena of people that lose because of stroke. And stroke is, of course, one of the major causes of function loss. So those would start to get interest, and that becomes a larger field. And what happens is that people make it broader. They say, well, if you can decode intentions, you might also be able to decode brain states for diseases like Parkinson's and epilepsy, and in that way inform when the device should start to fire to correct the disease. Like Parkinson's has a DBS, deep brain stimulation device, gives pulses in an overactive part of the brain to normalize it so that people can move normally, but they don't need it all the time. And the manufacturer thinks it's beneficial if you can make it smart so the device only acts when it's necessary. And that would be a larger market. Mm-hmm. But these are all still early days, but that's basically the scope that we're talking about. Mm-hmm. And then there's one more, that's psychiatric disorders. Brain implants for psychiatric disorders are starting to come. They exist for depression. And, being able to somehow help people with psychiatric disorders with devices would be a huge impact on society as a whole, because there's so many people with psychiatric problems. And people think that the combination of stimulation and listening to the brain is also going to be beneficial.
What concerns, if any, do you have about this technology?
There's the two domains to think about, right? If it's limited to the medical indication, where you use it to compensate for a loss of functionality, the first thing that comes to mind, assuming that they're on the market, is the price. Pricing will be prohibitive for people. The insurance company, for a long time to come, they're not just going to pay any price for a device. It needs to be affordable. Part of that, the research that's being conducted now with people, on the road to get there, are not necessarily aimed at showing that it benefits people. And when you don't do that, the people are basically signing up to be guinea pigs in the development. And I think we're growing beyond the stage where that can be justified. I think now that we know that we can offer people functionality at home, I think we should try to offer that to them as a payback for their spent time and undergoing the surgery. There are concerns about reading from the brain, especially with Neuralink, because it pumps tons of data from the brain into a cloud and not necessarily private. It doesn't say private. And we don't really know what kind of information can be extracted from that, whether it impinges on your privacy or something more fundamental about your individuality or personality. That makes people a little bit nervous, that you're basically opening yourself up as a user of the system, whether you're a patient or whether it's for healthy. Whether you're exposing yourself to certain risks that are impossible to predict right now. And there's no framework in place to regulate any of that. So I think that those are the most important components. What's often said is that brain surgery is dangerous. I think I don't think that's true anymore. I think in the Western world, the management of your physiology during surgery is extremely sophisticated, and you don't see many people pass away in the OR because of a failure to keep respiration and the heart rate and things in place. In our hands, it's a procedure. It sounds awful. We don't call it brain surgery. We call it skull surgery because we basically put electronic or electrodes underneath the skull. You don't do anything to the brain itself, and it's more than safe enough to do that. And according to Elon and to Neuralink, it's safe enough to actually offer it as elective surgery for people who don't need surgery but choose to get an implant.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Great. Well, at this point, I'd love to hear what some of the questions are that have come in. Lauren, do we have questions from the audience?
We have a number of questions about the consent process. So in particular, how is the research team consenting individuals to receive a brain-computer interface, especially if those individuals can't speak or have some cognitive deficiencies?
Yeah, it's a very good question. So we learned from people that have been working with severely paralyzed patients with EEG. So we learned what kind of limitations there were. So we built a protocol that takes about 3 or 4 hours for the consent procedure. But the whole lead up to the moment that we sit down and we go through the consent form and the signing of the consent takes about 3 months. We go back and forth to explain everything to them in understandable language. The legal representative is involved in all of this, and the caregiver and family members, so that we know in a pretty early stage that they're capable of understanding it. There's also neurologists, neuropsychologists involved to assess the cognitive capabilities with yes/no questions. It's doable, so they blink for yes, and once for yes and twice for no. That differs per person. And then the procedure itself, it does require the person to have one channel of communication, whether it's eye blinks or whether it's an eye tracker. We test the reliability of that with questionnaires where they need to get 100% of the questions right, like, is it day or is it night, simple questions. So we know that they're capable of understanding the procedure. Then we go back and forth for an hour to go through the protocol. We ask them questions about the protocol. Also, does it say this or does it say that? And in that, there is an independent observer with experience with people who are severely paralyzed. There is the legal representative, and it's recorded on a camera. And then at the end of it, the legal representative signs the consent form. So it's very careful, but we already know well before the consent form whether or not the person is able to understand the question. So we know the cognitive state. And as a kind of a backup, we also always perform a functional MRI scan, which is an MRI scan that is able to identify areas that are relevant for where we put the electrodes. And to do this, the participant or the candidate has to perform computer tasks while they're in the scanner. If we don't see the expected activity patterns, we know that the person is not able to follow the instructions. We automatically exclude them from participating. So there's multiple ways that we carefully look at this. And we've found 2 out of, I think, 8 candidates that we've done in the last 10 years that we turned down because we could not convince ourselves that this person was still cognitively intact. And that was devastating for the family who believed that this person was still capable, but we couldn't confirm that.
That's really interesting. So in that screening process, there's actually a risk to the family that the subject is actually not as cognitively aware as they had presumed they would be.
Yes, correct.
That's very interesting. So in bioethics, we like to say that informed consent is a process. It's not just a one-time discussion and the signature on a form. Is there an opportunity once the implant is in to sort of get a reaffirmation of consent? I mean, now that you're at that point a little bit better able to communicate with the individual, do you ever go back to and ask, is this something you still want to keep doing?
That's a very good question. kind of serendipity is that we need to make amendments to the protocol because we're developing algorithms and external components. And for each addition or change, we need to inform the ethics committee of a change in the protocol or an addition, and they evaluate that. And the moment that they approve it, the amendment is approved, and all the participants have to be reconsented. And we do that as a standard now. We have people participate for 1 year and they sign up for additional years every year, plus those frequent amendments that we need to consider. So they reconsent fairly frequently.
Mm-hmm.
We have some questions around private industry's work on computer-brain interfaces. So in particular, there's some concern about Neuralink and the fact that they may be putting the cart before the horse in terms of ethical considerations that they should be considering for their work. So it's a two-part question. One is, what do you think we can do to sort of force the hand of companies like Neuralink to think thoughtfully like you are about your research on BCIs? And secondly, how should the public participate in these types of ethical considerations about research like BCIs?
I think for the first question, I would definitely rely on regulatory bodies, and the FDA is one of them. And I think nobody understands why there's limited transparency on this this project or this study that Neuralink is now performing. I'm personally not convinced that they're cutting corners too much. I think they're doing a fairly thorough job, but they're not informing anyone about what they do. So I would trust the FDA to have the oversight to make sure that the steps are followed in line with the standard ethics frameworks as developed and prescribed by NIH, for instance. And it's the same in Europe. There's a medical ethical framework, and you have to follow those rules. If you don't follow the rules, then clearly you're in violation, and it's up to the notified body or even the government to take action in that. I don't quite know how to deal with non-transparency of the study results and the study procedure. I personally would like it to be public. It's a certain degree of exposure that everybody is entitled to, because that's, like the Neuralink system. If at some point the company and FDA say, okay, it's good enough, it can be sold, I would like to know what the study results are underneath that decision. And I think a lot of people would. So that might be something to rethink. For the public to participate in the BCA debate or in how it should be handled, that's a very tough question, because I don't think at this point we have a full grasp of the limitations of what's capable with BCIs. I can imagine there's a discussion in the legal framework whether there should be new laws for your neural law and things that emanate. A simple thing is, for instance, if someone has a BCI and they control their car and the car crashes and kills someone, then who is to blame? It's parallel to the robotics debates. Those are things that will evolve, and that we will learn as we go, as we find out what the most realistic and most desired functionality of the BCIs is. And we just don't know that. So when we limit to the realm of medical indication, I think that the frameworks that are in place that were developed for pharmaceutical industry and development should suffice for BCI. When you're talking about enhancement, implanting in clients who choose to get a device without a medical need, that's I think pretty uncharted terrain. It would be great if people start imagining what could happen there. The only equivalent I can think of is cosmetics. You can have medical procedures without any indication. You go somewhere and you buy it. And maybe we should think in terms of that kind of framework. and where brain implants differ from those applications. And that's not a simple question. If the surgery is safe, why would I not be able to get an implant and then hook it up to my computer and see what kind of things I can accomplish with the connection?
Nick, that reminds me of a question. At the end of your studies, do the devices stay in the patient, or are they removed? Is it easy to remove? So let's say if this is commercially available, someone changes their mind, they no longer want it. Is this something that can be easily removed? Tell me about the removal procedure.
So we have 5 options that we discuss with the person, and if in the course of the study they have become completely locked in where we cannot get any information, we talk with the family and the legal representative. One option is to take the whole system out, and there's 2 components to it. One is the parts that are outside of the skull, and it's usually the amplifier and the wireless transmitter. That's usually easier to remove. You open the skin and you remove it. But there's always the sensors underneath the skull, and that requires opening the skull. That makes the surgery much more involving. The first choice is to have everything taken out. The second is only the extracranial part, so the part outside of the skull. And then there's the option to leave everything in, but you switch it off. And there's the option to leave everything, but leave it on, even if it doesn't work now, that they can still try it and play with it. So those are the main options. In our experience, all patients in our hands that finalized the study chose to keep the whole system in, because it's safe. It doesn't cause it doesn't pose an extra risk to the body, especially after a couple of years. It's completely, any risk is completely gone. And the surgery is typically more risky. It's a burden to these people, especially when they're at the late stage. An anesthesia is quite taxing. It takes a long time for them to recover. People feel a little bit uncomfortable with family about making a decision to expose their family member to a surgery without knowing for sure that the person is okay with that. And basically you don't notice it. It becomes integrated with the body. So the surgeons have a very strong preference to leave everything in, to not breach the skin and risk infection. We also, as researchers, we prefer that. And if people really want, it bothers them to take out the safest parts first and then gradually go there. But all the devices are built they should be built in such a way that they are removable by surgeon. So there should not be parts that are traveling through the brain that you can't find anymore.
Mm-hmm.
We have a question on personalization of the BCI. So does the research team personalize the BCI for each patient, and if so, how?
That's an excellent question. So we like to think of the research as adaptive trial, where we learn as we go, because the information we get from these devices are not available anywhere else. They're the first in the world because there is no paralyzed person with electrodes implanted for other reasons. So we learn as we go, and we adapt our strategy to that, which by definition means that it's highly customized. And a nice example is the first and most successful candidate that I showed the image of. We gave her a click, and she wanted something to call the caregiver, so we developed an escape. So she has 2 different kinds of signals that she can use at any point in time. But the escape, like on a computer, it will also always bring her to a higher level in the software that has a button called My Caregiver. So that was a functionality, and then she wanted to use it at night. And we offered her the system at night. It turned out to give erroneous intention detections like 200 per hour. So the thing went crazy. And then we learned that the brain signal is completely different at night from the day. And we had to completely go back to the drawing board to develop a very different decoder that would be reliable at night, that she could use to wake up the system and then use her regular clicks to call a caregiver. So everything that we do is from customization and fully based on the needs of the end user. That will stabilize at some point. What I envision in, I don't know how many years, when BCI devices become a little more mainstream and the types of applications become clear, like you can have a brain click that allows you to scan through scanning software where each item on the screen lights up, and if the one lights up that you want, you make a click at that moment. Another application is where you have point and click, where you can actually move a mouse over the screen and generate a click. That's a very different decoding effort. There's, what we're looking at is give someone 20 different words, so they can give 20 different instructions by words. And there's, of course, the application where we try to translate brain signals directly into speech. So they're very different applications. And I think as we develop all those, based on the feedback of the end user, which I think is critical, it's the user-centered design of the software, people will get the option to, to use a subset of those capabilities. And that will be less customized, but more attuned to the needs of a range of different people.
You just mentioned the importance of receiving feedback from users, and that dovetails with another question we got about whether the research team has evaluated the BCI's users' sense of autonomy and personhood as a result of receiving the BCI, and if so, are there both advantages and disadvantages in that realm to receiving a BCI?
Yeah, thank you for the question. It's we know the discussion. We have assessed many different parameters from the end users, from our participants, in terms of what it means to them, or what they like and what they don't like, but not directly on personhood and things like that. We are right now in the middle of a trial. We got funding for a PhD student who is actually doing that. And why only now? Because you need certain numbers of people to get a reasonable, generalizable picture of what it means for people. And it's only now that we have, I think, 10 or 15 people that have been or are still participating in implant studies that are willing to communicate with the PhD student that we now have. So it's a really good point. And I think this is pretty much one of the earlier stages where we can start inventorying this. But even 10 or 15 people might not be enough. But at least we can get an idea of the scope and the playing field of what this means to people.
And I have one last question for you from an audience member who's curious about, you mentioned earlier in the conversation that BCI may be used down the line for psychological conditions. And are there any that seem particularly promising for BCI to mitigate some of the side effects of?
Not yet, because so DBS, they're like wires that are implanted in the brain at a very specific point where electrical activity will disrupt pathological activity, and it kind of restores the balance in the brain, which makes people able to move normally. That technology is 60 years old, 50 years old, and it just shows you how long it takes for that technology to become adopted by the medical field. And the same equipment can be used to treat depression. It doesn't work in every person. And people still try to figure out which areas should be targeted because the brain is huge in terms of areas. So there's the aspect of some hesitation to actually use implants in psychiatry because it's a catch-22. You don't, as a clinician, you don't want to prescribe a device to your patient if it hasn't proven to work. But to prove that it works, you need to implant in patients, and that slows down the process. In terms of adding the BCI component to the stimulation, because the standard stimulation is like a pacemaker in the heart. It just pulses every, so many times per second. It's like a dumb device, we call them. To make them smart and listen to the need of the brain, I think for people with schizophrenia, it could offer help in distinguishing hallucinations, auditory hallucinations, from real voices that come in. It's very hypothetical. We don't know whether that will help people, but that will be a step forward. And then you need to listen to what's happening in the brain to be able to tell the owner of the device, hey, you're hearing something, but this is not generated by people around you, it's generated by hallucinations. So that's the kind of things that we would think about in terms of functionality. It's early days. It's very early days, and there's a lot of stakeholders and a lot of factors that influence which way a promising development is going to move.
Nick, I want to return to something you said about quality of life. So the self-reported quality of life of people in locked-in syndrome tends to be much higher than what many other people would assume. After implant, does that assessment of quality of life dramatically increase? Is it a slight increase? How much does the implant itself and the technology impact a person's self-assessed quality of life in locked-in syndrome?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it depends. The numbers are too small to give a general statement. It all depends on your communication capabilities before and after the implant. For the target population that we're thinking of, people with ALS, they can still communicate when they participate and they get an implant. So for them, there is no change in quality of life because it stays the same, because they can maintain their abilities thanks to the device. If we would get someone who is a little later in the development and has not been able to communicate for a while, their quality of life will jump up when you get the device. So I don't think it's a simple relation that you can put between a device and the quality of life. And it's not our most important measure in our studies. For us, it stays high, but we don't rely on it too much for the reason I just told you. But we do look at how much a person uses it, which for us is direct and indisputable evidence of what it means to the user. If you use something a lot, it does something to you, and it helps you go through daily living. And that goes for almost anything. Like my phone, it really means a lot to me, and I use it a lot. So,
so one last question, because we're up on time now. In your research, Nick, has anything really surprised you? What was that?
Yeah. The first thing that surprised me is that we got very good signals in the candidate that I showed. She has ALS. We expected, based on what we knew about how the neurons are organized and how they function, that those neurons that normally give a signal in that part of the brain that we can use would no longer be there because they can't move because of death of those neurons. But we got the exact same signal that we're used to in people who are not paralyzed, and that's a different story, but we did a lot of the development of people with epilepsy who get electrodes implanted so the neurologist can find the source of the seizure. But while they're waiting for a seizure, we can do research. And we got the signal quality in our ALS patients is almost the same as in healthy people. It doesn't make any sense. It does. So we were happily surprised, which means that ALS people are proper candidates for this technique, which fully relies on the quality of the electrical signals generated by neurons. At the same time, we also did learn that those signals fade over time. And then in the end, it's too weak for us to be able to use it for a BCI, which is a very sad, discovery of sorts. Mind you, there's very little known about people with late-stage ALS, we call it late-stage ALS, because they're no longer in treatment. Neurologists are no longer involved, the rehabilitation specialist may be involved, not necessary. So nobody really does research with these people, not the kind of research that we do. Mm-hmm. So it's a very small numbers that's frustrating, but over time we'll learn more and more about these what happens in the brain in ALS.
Well, Nick, we're out of time, but I really wanted to thank you so much for taking us through a glimpse at the present and the future of this technology. It's fascinating work. I think your work brings a lot of hope to people in locked-in syndrome and their families and caregivers. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, and for our audience, thank you so much for joining us in this webinar series on behalf of the Center for Bioethics at Harvard Medical School and the Center for Life Sciences at the Museum of Science. Thank you for joining us today, and have a great rest of your day. Thank you.